Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to make a start so that we have plenty of time for the session. And what I say at the beginning is not particularly important, so it doesn't matter if people miss this part. So I just wanted to welcome you to this. This is one of the special organised sessions that is introduced by iHEA this year. I'm one of the co-chairs of the scientific committee. My name is Peter Sivvy from RMIT in Melbourne, Australia. I'm one of the co-chairs of the scientific committee for the healthcare markets, the organisation of healthcare markets sort of subfield. And so we organise one of the organised sessions, and our special organised session is this imperfect competition in healthcare markets theory and experiments. And the idea of this special organised session was really to investigate competition a bit more in detail. We had the plenary session from Carol Proper yesterday, outlining quite lots of empirical results and policy implications of the role of competition, especially in publicly funded healthcare systems. And the idea today is to go a bit behind the black box of competition, have a look at the underlying incentives. There's lots of imperfections in competition in healthcare that make competition in healthcare different from other areas of the economy. And so we've invited 3 eminent speakers on this topic. And we're going to have a mixture of theory and empirical data, experimental work, I think. So first of all, we're going to have Henry Mack talking about some theoretical work on imperfect competition and pay for performance. Then we're going to have Geir Godager from University of Oslo, Norway. He's going to talk about experimental results on physicians' preferences. And finally, Albert Marr is going to do a sort of survey of literature in this area on selection, quality, and imperfect competition. So I'm just going to start by introducing Henry Mack. He's our first presenter today. He's an assistant professor at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, where he started in 2012 after graduating from his PhD here at Boston University. He was also a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in 2011, and he's published several papers on theoretical models relevant to healthcare and healthcare markets in journals like the RAND Journal of Economics, Journal of Economic Behavioural Organisation. And so we'll just welcome Henry to the stage for the first presentation. I think this was my fault, sorry.
Okay, great.
Good.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon and welcome. So this section is about imperfect competition. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is to present a theoretical model about imperfect competition and pay for performance. So let me begin with imperfect competition. If you are interested in the industrial organization of healthcare markets, you should be familiar with the idea that competition among healthcare providers are imperfect. And in fact, before year 2000, that is like 10, 15 years ago, most of the papers in healthcare economics or health service would say that health services qualities were not measurable, not contractable. So back at that time, payers usually uses prices to so without quality being measurable, usually prices are not based on qualities. So payers can only choose prices, and then given the prices, the providers are going to choose qualities to compete with each other. And here, the basic mechanism that incentivizes quality provision is competition. If the quality is high, then the hospital may be able to attract more patients. But the problem is that this competition is not perfect because, for example, due to transportation costs, patients are not quite willing to travel very far, even if the quality of the hospitals that is far away is high. But things are changing in the last 10, 15 years because of the in particular because it is now much easier to collect information and data about quality. And because of this, nowadays, healthcare's qualities are essentially measurable by the payers and contractable by the payers. And because quality becomes contractable, now many payers in many countries are trying to use pay for performance in order to incentivize qualities. And in fact, in year 2016, there are at least 34 pay for performance programs in 14 OECD countries. And for example, in the US, we have this hospital value-based purchasing program, which is a pay-for-performance program that is designed for hospitals taking care of elderlies. And then in the UK, we have this Commissioning for Quality and Innovation program, which is a pay-for-performance program initiated by the National Health Service. But if you look at the evidence, what is interesting is that after we have spent quite a bit of time to design and evaluate all these pay-for-performance programs, what is shown in the data is that, in general, pay-for-performance programs in different countries display mixed, modest, and short-lived improvement at best. In some pay-for-performance programs nowadays are not quite effective. Now, other than the evidence, how about we look at the theory? Well, once you look at the theoretical literature on pay-for-performance, it is usually based on the bilateral principal agent problem, which means that there is one payer in the model and there is one provider in the model. The payer design an incentive contract to incentivize the provider to provide high-quality services, but there is no competition. But now if you look at the healthcare market, we can see that we have both pay-for-performance nowadays, but also imperfect competition. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to try to set up a very, very, very simple model that is going to incorporate pay-for-performance into imperfect competition, okay? So I promise you that this will be the simplest theoretical model that I can imagine about imperfect competition. So let me start with my model. Well, this is half of my model. So I want to consider imperfect competition. And this is a hoteling model. So this is about horizontal differentiation. So in my model, there are two hospitals, Hospital 0 and Hospital 1. They are horizontally differentiated in the sense that Hospital 0 is at location 0, whereas Hospital 1 is at location 1. So I have a continuum of consumers that are on this line. For example, if you look at consumer X, this is the consumer's location, and then the consumer choice is between going to Hospital 0 for service or Hospital 1 for service. So the quality of service at Hospital 0 is Q0, and the quality of service at Hospital 1 is Q1. And the problem here is that other than the quality, the consumers also care about the transportation cost. And in this diagram, you can see that if consumer X chooses to go to Hospital 0, then the distance between consumer X and Hospital 0 is X, and hence the transportation cost is tau X. And if this consumer chooses to go to Hospital 1, then the distance between the consumer and this hospital is 1 minus X, and therefore the transportation cost is tau times 1 minus X. Okay, so now I have a model with imperfect competition between two hospitals. And I want to consider how the payer should design pay-for-performance program. So I allow the payer to choose a base service price and a bonus rate. So I will use P to denote the price and the B to denote the bonus rate. Let me first focus on Hospital Zero. So Hospital Zero is going to choose its own, the service of its own quality to maximize profit. And of course, in this very simple model, profit is revenue minus cost. What is revenue? Revenue is demand times the price plus the bonus revenue. And the bonus revenue depends on the bonus rate and the quality. And what is the demand? Well, because consumers are horizontally differentiated, the demand of Hospital Zero would depend on the quality of both Hospital Zero and Hospital One. If the quality of Hospital Zero is higher, it is going to attract more patients. But if Hospital One raises its quality, then Hospital Zero is going to lose some patients to Hospital One. Okay? So this is the demand, this is the income from each patient, and then this is the cost of providing the health service, which depends on the demand, that is the number of patients that the hospital treats, and the quality. Okay? And Hospital One is going to choose quality one to compete with Hospital Zero. And of course, the profit of Hospital One is very similar to Hospital Zero, and therefore I'm going to skip that. So in my very simple model, the payer is going to choose price and bonus rate in order to achieve two objectives, which is to say that optimal price and bonus rate have to do the following two things. First of all, they have to make sure that the hospitals are going to choose the efficient quality level. And second, they have to make sure that the hospitals are going to break even. But because this is an imperfect competition model, these prices and this bonus rate have to take competition into account. So let me skip all the algebra and show you the main result of this very simple model. First of all, the good news is that indeed in my model, the payer can choose base price and pay for bonus rate to achieve the efficient quality level. And what I find is that in order to achieve efficiency, the payer has to set the bonus such that the bonus depends on the social benefit of quality, the elasticity of demand, and the cost structure. Okay, so let me be more specific. So we call that B is the bonus rate and Q is the quality. So B times Q is the bonus. What this big equation is trying to show you is that the bonus would depend on V times Q0. We call that Q0 is the quality and V is how much the consumers value quality. Okay, so this is the social benefit of quality. But what is new here is that the bonus not only depends on the social benefit of quality, but it also depends on how consumers are going to respond to quality and depends on the cost. Okay, we call that C is the cost of providing service for Hospital Zero. So C divided by the demand is the average cost. And the last term is the change in the hospital cost when the hospital treats more one patient. So this is the marginal cost. So what this equation is trying to tell you is that the optimal bonus rate depends on the interaction between consumer demand response and the cost structure. And the cost structure is captured by the differences between the average cost and the marginal cost. So let me use two examples to illustrate the basic intuition here. For example, think about health service with marginal cost that is much lower than average cost. For example, imaging services. Okay, so what this equation is trying to say is that for imaging services, the optimal bonus is decreasing in the demand elasticity. And of course, here the demand elasticity captures the market condition and the intensity of competition between the hospitals. And the reason why the optimal bonus for this imaging service is decreasing in demand elasticity, is that here the marginal cost of providing service is pretty low. It means that the hospital would have very strong incentive to attract patients when the consumer's demand is high. But then in that case, it means that the optimal bonus for the quality should be low. Now consider another health service with marginal cost that is much higher than average cost. For example, because of capacity constraint, it is very difficult for the hospital to provide an additional unit of service. And in that case, what this equation is trying to say, what this equation is trying to say is that the optimal bonus should be increasing in demand elasticity. And here the basic intuition is that when the marginal cost of serving an additional consumer is very high, then the hospital actually does not benefit from the increase in the consumers that the additional consumer that it can attract by raising quality. And in that case, in order to incentivize the hospital to increase quality, the payer has to set the bonus high enough that is, in fact, which it has to be higher than the social benefit. Okay, so now this equation actually has, well, there are two different ways that we can use to interpret this formula. First of all, for the normative implications, first of all, I now have a formula that we can use to think about how to set pay for performance optimally under imperfect competition. So we call that, in my very simple model, hospitals are trying to maximize profit, and that this is the cost of, and that all the hospitals that have the same cost, and that consumers are very rational. So what I have shown, but what I also find is that when health services have multiple qualities, or when the providers have heterogeneous cost structures, which means that the providers have different production costs for health services, or when the payers use demand-side cost sharing, which is when the payer asks consumers to bear some of the cost of the health services, or when consumers may misinterpret the quality of the different providers, the same formula continue to characterize the optimal bonus, which means that this formula is quite robust to different ways that we manipulate the market structure. And in addition, if I incorporate providers' intrinsic motivation, or if I let the hospital to be not-for-profit organization, or if I introduce equity concerns to the model, then there is only then what I only need is a very small adjustment on the formulas. So the normative implication is that, first of all, I now have a formula that can be a guidance on how policymakers should set pay for performance optimally under perfect competition. But in my opinion, this is quite an optimistic way to think about pay for performance under imperfect competition. And other than the normative implications, I think there are a few positive implications that I can obtain from this very simple model. First of all, I think it is very important that quality being contractable does not imply that policymakers are now contracting quality optimally. Okay, so contractability does not imply optimal contract. So bonus should be set, it is quite important that bonuses are set in an optimal way. And this is because of the interaction between explicit quality bonus incentive and implicit incentive due to competition and other factors. And what is important is that it implies that when we think about pay for performance policy, one size does not fit all. So for example, in the US, the Medicaid set aside the 1% of the budget as the for bonuses. And what this equation is trying to say is that when with the same bonus rate, hospital may respond differently due to the market condition or cost structure. And finally, what I think the most important is that we need more work to understand the incentive systems in healthcare markets. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Henry, for that great presentation. So we've just got a bit of time for questions now, maybe around 8 minutes or so. If you do have a question, could I ask if you could come up to one of the microphones? I know it's a bit of a pain, but it's because it's live streaming so that the online viewers can hear the question as well. So does anybody have any questions, and would they mind coming up to the microphone if that's the case? Okay, I have sort of prepared. I have a question. Okay, so a lot of your previous work, you've done quite a bit of work on public reporting.
Yeah.
So part of how public reporting would fit in with this seems to be the demand elasticity. Yes. So, but I wasn't immediately clear. What would be the implications if you introduce public reporting, that is, hospital quality becomes more available, therefore maybe the demand elasticity with respect to quality increases? How does that affect the optimal bonus and pay for performance? So what's that sort of interaction between public reporting and pay for performance?
Okay, yeah. So first of all, when consumers are more aware of the quality differences, the demand elasticity is going to go up. And when the demand elasticity is going up, this equation tells you that whether the optimal bonus should go up or go down actually depends on the cost structure. So if the cost structure is such that the marginal cost is pretty low, then the competition is a very useful way to incentivize quality. In that case, the optimal bonus should go down. But if the marginal cost is pretty high, then in that case, the optimal bonus should actually go up when the demand elasticity go up. And I guess this is pretty counterintuitive. And the basic intuition is that when the marginal cost of providing additional service is very high, then actually firms do not benefit from expanding the market share. And in that case, it is useful to set a higher bonus.
Would you like to come up to, could you come up to the microphone? Is that okay? Okay, we could try and repeat your question if you could, yeah.
Okay, this is Yao Hui from Toulouse School of Economics. And I would like just a question concerning this equation.
Yep.
I would like to ask, what is the specific role of imperfect competition in this equation? You're saying that, okay, B is correlated with demand elasticity.
Yep.
And we know that regardless of the market structure of this hospital, we know that demand elasticity of quality should be, positive with respect to, should be positive. So what's your model? What's the role of imperfect competition in deriving this formula, and what's the role of this in your intuitions? Thanks.
So I guess when the competition is perfect, then if Hospital Zero's quality is just epsilon higher than Hospital 1, then Hospital Zero is going to get the entire market share. And it is true that because this is quality elasticity of demand, this is always positive, but the size and the magnitude of the elasticity actually determines the bonus. So when the market is more competitive, it means that the quality elasticity is higher, and it has implications about how the optimal bonus should be set.
Okay. And a follow-up question would be, what is the price here is missing? The hospitals, they are competing via qualities, and you're assuming price to be free for patients, or what is the role of price? Could you elaborate a little bit more?
So, for example, think about hospital competition either in the US for Medicare patients or for hospital competition in the UK. It is very, in this market, the prices that hospitals get for services are actually set by the payer. And there is very limited role for the consumer's cost sharing to pay. And therefore, in this focus on the supply side, I focus on how the payers set the prices that the providers get for services. But in an extension of this model, I show that it doesn't matter whether consumers are paying a cost share or not.
This would be the last question, maybe? Thanks. Okay.
Hi, Dan Montanaro, Georgia State University. So in the model, it seems like the payer, the sponsor, knows the optimal level of quality. I'm thinking of maybe an extension where the payer can observe quality, but they don't necessarily know which one's optimal, or only patients know what level of quality they want. Is there some kind of analogous model to a payer, in a sense, pricing quality without specifying here's what the quality should be, more like your pay will increase this much depending on which quality you choose?
So I have an extension which may not be exactly the same as what you have in mind, but which is quite similar. In my extension, service qualities are multidimensional, and that the payer can only base bonus on one of the two qualities. And in that case, I find that it may even be not optimal to use pay for performance. And in that case, the payer may become better off by just using fixed prices. But I think this is one of the things that we have learned from the multitasking literature. So it is important that when we think about pay for performance, whether all the qualities are contractable or not. Yes.
Okay, shall we just say thanks again to Henry for the presentation? Okay, so our second presenter today is Geir Godjiger from University of Oslo in Norway. He's an associate professor and graduated from his PhD in 2009. He's published several papers in the Journal of Health Economics and Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization related to using experimental data to measure physician altruism, the effects of performance reporting, and other topics in the economics of healthcare markets. So over to Geir.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm presenting a paper in the second half of my presentation, which is a paper by my student, Gigi, and the co-authors are Jian Wang and Daniel Wiesen. And Gigi is here today to help me out if there's any troubles when I'm going through the results. But my first half of this presentation is to motivate what we have done. So health economics as a field have kind of developed by a set of motives which I will go through, and I will describe two types of experiments which are been applied in the use of in health economics experimental work. And like I said, in the second half, I will present results, brand new results from a very recent experiment we have conducted as late as in April. So, health economic research has been motivated by a search for remedies for addressing market imperfections and to improve welfare. And it has gradually developed such that experiments have been motivated by the increasing demand for causal evidence on functioning of markets, and also the demand for evidence-based policies. So, and I'm introducing some notation here so I would like you to ask you to remember this, that I use X for the incentives or the scenarios that are controlled by experimenters, and Y that are used for responses of, that are observed by the subjects in experiments. And I'm going to describe two types of experiments, which I will refer to as incentivized lab experiments and discrete choice experiments. These are simply two types of experiments. So the first type of experiments here, incentivized lab experiments, I'm mentioning a bunch of authors here, so that those who have read these papers, they would perhaps immediately understand what type of experiments I'm thinking of. These are controlled lab experiments with real financial incentives, which enables the identification of causal effects with a very high degree of realism. The other type of experiments is discrete choice experiments, where it's a clever design of the choice menus that you invite people to answer, but these are typically not conducted in a lab. They are often conducted by use of surveys, etc. And here also have a bunch of authors, which if you read these papers, these authors, you will perhaps recognize what type of experiments I'm thinking of. And these type of experiments, they are typically set up to with the aim of identifying and quantifying the preferences of individuals with regard to particular goods or items. And these type of data from discrete choice experiment, they are typically analyzed by use of choice modeling, that McFadden type of analysis. So experiments, they have their strengths and weaknesses, and the strengths with these two type of experiments I already mentioned, but the Achilles heel of all experiments, that is the external validity of the experiment. And there are many problems with external validity, but I will mention two main types of problems, and this is that the experimental scenarios that we implement in the lab might have a varying degree of relevance to what the world looks like. So this is the type of problem that a typical biologist would have with his greenhouse. You can do some things with your plants in your greenhouse, but when you put the plants out in the world, there are other factors that are making the greenhouse less relevant. So this is a standard external validity problem in experiments that applies to all type of experiments. But when you're analyzing humans, you have an additional external validity problem, and that is the fact that human beings, they understand that they are part of an experiment if you run experiments in the lab. So this problem with external validity relates to the fact that an individual's response to a particular change in financial incentives or other economic incentives might not give the same response from a human being in an experimental setting as in the real world setting. So this is a different level of external validity problem. And it's the problem which is hardest, the most difficult problem to solve. And this, I will argue, this you can do something about. And this is part of the motivation for the paper I'm presenting in the second half. And the argument is that subjects, they carry their preferences with them. So if you actually are able to learn something about a subject's preferences, they are valid as they go out of the greenhouse, out of the laboratory. So the argument is that you can improve the external validity of type 1 if you do not aim at analyzing whether a change in X causes a change in Y, whether a change in X causes a difference in behavior. But you aim at actually measuring the preferences of individuals. So in the plant analogy, you try to learn as much as possible about the plant. That's the idea. So what we do in the forthcoming, the presentation the paper I'm presenting in the second half is to combine what is the best part of the incentivized lab experiments, which is the control of this environment where decisions are made, real incentives, and we combine this with choice scenarios that are very carefully designed using methods of the discrete choice experimental paradigm. And we analyze the data with discrete choice modeling, which are consistent with neoclassical utility theory, the McFadden type of modeling. And these type of models have shown to be able to provide external validity in the sense that you repeatedly see examples of very precise estimates of demands for goods before these goods even exist. And the example is, the oldest example is the Bay Area Rapid Transportation System in San Francisco, where these guys predicted the demand before this system was even built. Some more notation before we proceed to the paper. Pi is profit, B is the medical benefit for patients, and C is the patient consumption. So in analysis of imperfect markets, a very, very important and fundamental cornerstone is the preferences of the individuals that are part of these markets, and in particular, the preferences of physicians. And here, there are the specification by Ellis and McGuire in 1986 and 1990 has become a very commonly used specification, but in particular because as they show in the 1990 paper, it relates to a specification where it's a bargaining between the patient and the provider in a situation where there is full insurance. However, there might not always be full insurance, and this is captured by the model by Farley, 86, where we see that the preference of the provider also include the consumption level of the patient. Because different treatments may have different co-payment levels, and if you care about the co-payment level, you also care about the consumption level, of course, because they are linearly dependent. So the hypothesis of our paper is that the patient consumption level is part of the provider's objective, and that the marginal utility of patient consumption is different from zero. So what we do, we design an incentivized and discrete choice experiment to identify both the first-order derivatives and the second-order derivatives, including the cross partials. We have 3 incentivized attributes: profit, medical benefit, and patient consumption. And we pay the decision makers in cash to capture the profit. We treat a randomly chosen patient on campus nearby the decision makers, and we also transfer cash to the same patient depending on decisions that are made in our lab experiments. And we design the choice menus to maximize the amount of information that are acquired from the decisions that the individuals are making. So we use a D-efficient design, which are quite by an algorithm. I will give you a brief example of a decision-making screen. So we vary these 3 attributes: the profit of the decision maker, the cash he can put in hand; the amount of health benefit, the amount of money we transfer to the patient's hospital account; and the amount of cash we actually transfer in cash in hand to the patient, which is to capture varying co-payment level. So after the co-payment, the individual will have a different amount of money available depending on the co-payment. So if you see that the the patient gets only a little cash after the treatment is done, it means that the co-payment was high. We can do variations in all dimensions here, and we are very careful that we are able to get ceteris paribus changes. For example, here holding the profit fixed and varying only 2 of the attributes, etc. So here we see that the provider can choose alternative A, where the patient health benefit is relatively high, but this is costly for the patient. But for himself, his profit is not different from the 2 treatments. Yeah, we don't have time to look at many choice scenarios, but we vary all items in all directions here. The design is overlapping. It contains 80 overlapping blocks. It contains 80 choice sets in the 3-dimensional diagram. There are always 2 alternatives to choose from, and there are 202 medical students invited to make this, to contribute to this choice experiment. And we do it at the same time, so they do not have any chance to talk to each other before and after the experiment. We have one experiment with 202 people at the same time. We have detailed test questions to make sure that they actually understand what they are doing and that they understand this, okay, this means co-payment is high, this means co-payment is low, etc. And we randomly choose one of the participants to go with us and actually monitor the transfer of the cash and the medical benefit to the patient. Of course, the functional form of utility functions is not trivial. There are many alternatives. We have so far estimated 2 versions, a translog utility function and a quadratic utility function. And here are the results. We estimate this utility function by means of simulated maximum likelihood estimation. We have 3,000 Halton rows in our estimation, which means that we have a high degree of accuracy in our simulations. And as you remember, these elements here are parameters of these expressions here. So these are it's hard to see directly the interpretation of this. So I will help you and I will tell you what it means. It means that the marginal utilities of all 3 items is positive. The marginal utilities, they are diminishing in all the 3 items. This is as expected. But there are some things that we did not have any prior expectation and that regards to the cross partials. We see, for instance, that the cross partials between profit and patient benefit, we cannot reject that that is actually 0. And we cannot reject that the partial with regard to profit and consumption is 0 either, which means that it seems like the utility function is separable in profit and the utility of the patient. We find that the cross partial between the patient's medical benefit and the patient consumption level is negative, implying that the consumption level of the patient and the patient's medical benefits are, from the perspective of the provider, substitutes. And we can, from our results, simulate the distribution of the marginal utilities, and that we are presenting here. We see that the red curve here is the marginal utility of patient's health benefit, and we see that this is dominating the marginal utility of patient consumption. And what the typical provider cares least about is own profit. And we have also computed the marginal rate of substitution between patient benefit and profit, and also patient consumption and profit. And when you do the simulations, we get very, very long, tiny, slim tails here. So we need to zoom in a bit. This is the 98% confidence interval. But if we zoom in, we see that it looks like this. It's a familiar distribution with a long tail to the right. And this is not happening because of and assuming any distribution which actually are asymmetric, we have assumed that the only things that are varying are normally distributed. And this is something I think it looks very beautiful. It's actually plotting the results in a graphical representation, and we can present the indifferent curves of providers when they where you have profit on one axis and patient benefit on the other axis. And we see here that individuals are willing to give up a lot of profit for a small amount of patient health benefits. And we also see that it seems like it's the preferences in the profit dimension tends to be more linear than in the patient benefit dimension. So to summarize the findings, we find evidence from the translog estimations and the quadratic estimations to be consistent with each other. We find marginal utilities are positive and diminishing in all the three attributes. And the fact that we find that providers care about patient consumption level in a situation where you have demand-side cost sharing, that means that the demand-side cost sharing will influence medical decisions of providers. We consistently find that the marginal utility of patient benefit is larger than the marginal utility of consumption, which again is larger than the marginal utility of profit. But the fact that marginal utility, our results that marginal utility of patient benefit is larger than the marginal utility of consumption, that means that providers, they are altruistic towards the patient, but it's an inefficient kind of altruism in the sense that they are willing to reduce the patient's utility in order to improve the patient's health. So that means even a salaried doctor will, in some situations, according to these results, over-provide healthcare services. And we find that patients' medical benefit and patient consumptions are substitutes. And we can also not reject the hypothesis that there is no interaction between patient benefit and profit and patient benefit and consumption. Yeah. That's all.
Okay, can we say thanks to Guy for the presentation? Okay, so we've got some time for questions. He was trying to escape, but I didn't let him. So if you do have a question, would you mind coming up to the front? Any arms in the air? Otherwise, I can ask a question again, actually, because I understand the idea here that you're including patient consumption as well as patient benefit in the utility function, and you referenced Farley, had a reference to Farley in 1986. I missed exactly why would somebody have that preference. Okay, so what is the reason why? And you found that they do have that preference. They do actually place a positive marginal utility on increasing patient consumption. But what's the argument in that original paper about why they should have that? And you do call it inefficient altruism or sort of irrational kind of altruism in the end. But what is the reason why you would have that preference, or is it just sort of a mistake on the part of the doctors to have that preference?
Well, I don't think it's a mistake, and the idea I got from a real-world experience, where I experienced that my doctor wanted me to save some money to buy some cheap drugs in Sweden. But in order to do this, he had to write a prescription on paper, which he never do. Otherwise, he just mails the pharmacy. But he had to find this paper prescription. He had to do some extra work to save me money by traveling to Sweden to buy cheap drugs.
Great. Okay. Does anybody else have a question at this point? Maybe you had time to think of a question. Randy's come to the front here.
Glad to see you building on the Elsie McGuire model. There have been others who have argued the reason that instead of putting in consumption, you can put out-of-pocket payments in for the consumer. And the doctors may know that there's cost sharing, and then the question is whether they care if they're charging you implicitly another $100 or a large amount perhaps by recommending the more expensive drug or the more expensive provider. And so that's another rationale. But consumption also could be thought of as affecting the benefit function or the utility of the patient. So it's not obvious that it belongs as a separate argument. Do you have any comments on that?
A very good question. Ideally, we would have the utility of the patient as an object of the utility function of the provider. However, I doubt that we can identify the marginal utility of a utility. So that's why we have the marginal utility of observable things. But it's a very good point. Yeah.
Yes,
And
Albert?
one more, one of your first question about consumption versus out-of-pocket payment. One is that they are linearly dependent, so it's kind of very difficult to identify the separate effect. And also, ideally, these effects are something that these effects are probably different from a rich and poor person. And we did not have. If I get $1 million, I would also vary the income of the patient to check if this effect is different over depending on the income level of the patient. Yeah.
Albert has a question, I think.
I guess I want to follow up on Randy's issue. Utility function, the list can go on. After pi, after b, after c, you can write d, e, f, g. We make assumptions to make life easier for us. It would be nice to see if there is sort of a definite end to this. Would there be sort of some thought about doing a placebo? The color of the shirt the patient is wearing, I'm going to put that into the utility function and let the subject make a choice. Do you think that you will be able to sort of destroy this sort of placebo issue?
So I would not like, I do not feel use the whole alphabet, but to your question about theoretical modeling and making things easy, we do find that the cross partial is not significantly different from zero. And I think this is a useful thing for theoretical modeling to be able to continue using that assumption. We cannot reject this based on the data we have. And I would guess that this is one useful result.
Okay, I've got another sort of another utility. Actually, I was thinking with the OR-C, and I'm not sure if I'm understanding it completely. You know, so they get utility from providing more care or providing, or the consumer consuming more. So another personal anecdote. My mum was a GP in the NHS, and she often told me that when she was treating her patients, she considered the costs to the NHS of providing care. You know, so doctors in the UK are very sort of indoctrinated into the National Health Service and the idea that the National Health Service has limited funds and that they've really got to be careful not to treat their patients too much because you know, they're often aware of this sort of budget constraints of the government when they're providing care. Certainly, that's what she told me, and doctors may vary about that. So this sort of thing might, I guess, this might vary across context about you know, how doctors are trained and what they're supposed to be thinking about when they're providing care. And have you thought about this issue of the doctors actually not wanting to waste money, not wanting to sort of prescribe drugs that are unnecessary or refer patients unnecessarily to specialists or those sort of issues?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and that is. Would be interesting to look at it, but it's always the case that when you add another letter in the alphabet,
Yeah.
then the costs are exponentially increasing in terms of the number of observations you need to identify.
Maybe
this,
Tony, should we have a last question?
Yeah, Tony Sawyer, University of Melbourne. It's great to see the incentivised choice experiment, and I hope it'll be good to compare it with a non-incentivised choice experiment to see if it does make a difference, and that would be reasonably straightforward to do. It was a question just about the experimental design. Was it a full factorial design? Because I guess if most DCs have a pretty simple linear utility function, not translog and not quadratic, and often to have those interaction terms, the design has to be big enough in terms of a full factorial to incorporate those interactions. So was it a full factorial experimental design in terms of all possible combinations?
No, it was not. It was not. It was a fractional factorial design,
Okay.
but it was set up to identify the second order terms.
Okay.
And we used Arne Riise-Hole's program Decreate to get the Bayesian efficiency up and standing, and we got a D-efficient design with this 80 choice alternatives, choice occasions.
With all the interactions in the
With all the
design.
interactions, second order terms.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, great. I think it's time to move on to our last presentation. So thanks to Gaia. So our last presenter today is Albert Marr. He's a professor of economics here at Boston University. He graduated with a PhD in economics from LSE in 1988. He didn't want me to say that then. He's published seminal papers in top journals such as the AER, QJ, Econometrica, as well as the health economics field journals on many topics in theory of the economics of healthcare, including sort of classic important topics like adverse selection, moral hazard, agency and cost, public reporting and competition. So over to Albert for the last presentation.
Thank you very much for coming here to listen to us. I'm Albert Marr, but I have to figure out how to get rid of this first. Maybe this one will do. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for blowing my cover. Because I went to the mentoring lunch. When I arrived, the assistant of iHEA said, "Are you a mentor or a mentee?" I was so happy for the entire session. I have something to talk to you about today. This is a title that has sort of three kinds of stuff in it: selection, quality, and imperfect competition. Part of this is based on continuing work with a graduate student here, Henry Lin. I'm going to try to summarize sort of 50 years of literature about this selection and quality and imperfect competition in about 20 minutes. So I need to begin with a little prop. Okay, so what is selection? Let me ask you, what is selection by means of an apple? This is a kind of apple that everybody has, right? You recognize this? Maybe you already ate it. This is part of your lunch, right? So, question, does the production of this apple depend on who eats it? No, not really, right? I can throw it out and then you can grab it and you eat it. I eat it now, it doesn't matter. I would ask a question like this to my graduate students or even MA students or even undergraduate students. And they answer correctly. It does not matter whether you eat it or anybody else eating it. It's the same cost of production. And then I ask my question, I ask my students the next question. Does it matter to me? Does it matter to me who comes to my classes? Is it more difficult for me to teach a class with students who are lazy, not motivated, and ill-prepared? Then they start not looking at me already. And then I continue, well, is it better for me if I have students who come and they are well-motivated, hardworking, and very smart? A few of them look up to me. I said, now everybody understands that sometimes the cost of production of something depends on who actually consumed this thing. Most of the time, this thing is not a thing, it's not a real thing, like an apple, is a surface. Healthcare is a prime example. Insurance is another kind of example, financial products. It's not just things like that. So sometimes physical products can also have a selection issue. If you rent a car, you lease a car for 3 years, well, the cost of renting or leasing you the car really depends on how much of a driver you are. If you like driving the ultimate machine, well, the cost can be quite high. If you like an old lady driving a Toyota, the cost can be a little bit lower. Right? So selection means production cost depends on consumers' preferences, but preferences are private information. There's some elderly ladies who are driving, whose driving habit is like driving the ultimate driving machine. And then in the literature, we have sort of diverged into two main categories, is adverse selection and advantageous selection. They're all emanating from a set of papers by Akerlof, Spence, and Rothschild and Stiglitz in the 1970s. It's been around for some time. So to talk about adverse selection and advantageous selection, I need to talk about preferences. So here's my sort of second slide. Yeah. So consumers, now I'm going to think about consumers with quality valuations distributed on some interval with some density and cumulative density. And consumers getting a good at quality Q will get some utility, and I call that V times Q. It costs some money to get this good, let me call that the price. So the utility, the net utility consumer V gets is this very familiar form, VQ minus P. And there's an outside option of not buying anything, that's 0, and I'm going to call Mr. V hat, the guy who is just indifferent between buying and not buying, sort of the marginal consumer. Anybody whose valuation is above this V hat will buy the good. Cost and selection is summarized by a cost function for quality Q that depends on the identity of the buyer. C of Q, comma V is sort of the unit cost of producing this good at quality Q, but only for consumer V. Think about hip replacement. There's some quality of replacing a hip, that's called a Q. And there's some inherent characteristic of the patient, that's V. When V changes, the unit cost of providing the hip replacement at some quality is also changing. I'm going to use the standard assumption, and think about the standard assumption on the quality cost is increasing in quality, convex in quality. Then adverse selection says that high valuation consumers are more costly to treat. Those who are having a good time receiving the hip replacement will be more costly. And advantageous selection is something like this cost function is decreasing in V. High valuation people are less costly to treat. In general, this function may not be monotone. It can go up and down. That's permitted, but that's not been very much studied in the literature, but there's potentially, you can think about issues like that. All right, just a simple setup. So what have I done? I've set up sort of an economy with some consumers and then with some production possibility. There's a firm producing this good at some unit cost, and so on and so forth. So what is the upshot of this? The upshot of this is that our usual welfare analysis already screwed up. So typically, you think about cost of production. Who should get this apple? Somebody whose valuation is high should get this apple. If you don't like apple, you like oranges. Your valuation is not high, you shouldn't get it. Right? Your valuation above the cost, then you should buy the apple, otherwise you don't buy the apple. Okay, good. So now I've drawn 4 diagrams. On each diagram, there's a straight line is labeled V times Q. So as you fix the quality, but as you vary the evaluation, the benefit goes up. So VQ is an upward sloping straight line. So now I've drawn 4 other lines which are not quite the VQ line, but the first one on the top left corner is like a U-shaped curve. This is the selection curve. The cost of producing this good at quality Q for Mr. V. All right, so who should buy this good? Those whose valuation is above the cost, the people who are in the middle. Who are in the middle here. And what about the second diagram to the right top corner? And here, this is the lower valuation people should be buying this. And then in this is more conventional. The third and the fourth diagram, we have high valuation people buying this good. Downward sloping is advantageous selection. Upward sloping is adverse selection. This is also adverse selection. Right, so many things can happen once you have a sort of type-dependent cost of production. That's things that can mess up our discussion. What about the market? Yes. The market would have a firm offering this quality, this good at some quality at some price. We saw what the demand structure looks like. There's high valuation people buy it. High valuation people are those with valuation above V hat. So the total number of people buying would be sort of this 1 minus the cumulative distribution. Okay? And then you write down your profit function. And then you discover that the profit function is equal to the demand times the price minus buyer's average cost. Because you're serving all those people with valuation above a certain thing and their costs are varying, you have to sum them up together and then divide by the total number of people buying, and that's your thing. Okay, so what is the issue? Selection and average cost becomes relevant. The average cost of serving people, who are the people buying, those with valuation above a certain threshold, you sum them up, divide by the total number of people. I put an upper part, U superscript to it, and this is the upper part of the cost distribution. Selection is really about the difference between average and marginal. And that has become sort of the guiding principle in the literature. How do they differ in terms of adverse selection? The average is always above the marginal. And in terms of advantageous selection, the average is always below the marginal. Now suddenly you recall, when I was studying, people would, my professor would tell me, well, when the average is above or below, what do you call that? Returns to scale, either increasing or decreasing. I don't have anything like that in here. Okay? This is not fixed cost. This is a constant unit cost, but it's varying with respect to the number of people buying. It nevertheless gives you the kind of flavor that you found in the literature. What is the issue in the literature? In the literature, well, you have depth spiral because of selection, Cutler and Reber, and many other papers talking about depth spiral. Okay, so what is the issue? The issue is really because of the divergence between the marginal cost and the average cost. Competition wants things to be breaking even, wants firm to be breaking even, and therefore the average cost function will determine the price. And all the Cutler-Reber analysis, well, average cost would become the price. But now, if the average cost is like the price, then what happens to the marginal cost is either above or below. What do you see? Inefficiency. Efficient allocation should be decided by the marginal cost. It never happens in selection model. The prices are always wrong in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so that's one of the first thing that we learn in selection. Now I'm going to switch to, there's a profit maximizing pricing quality. Let me just quickly go over this. Okay, now it doesn't matter when you have an imperfectly competitive market. It's perfectly fine for monopolists to maximize profit even when the technology exhibits something like discrepancy between marginal cost and average cost. It doesn't care. It just wants to maximize its profit. Well, you can do whatever algebra that you want to do. Let's just imagine that this monopolist wants to maximize profit by choosing quality and price. And you end up with a profit maximizing quality that is like this. The marginal consumer's valuation is equal to some weighted average of the marginal cost of quality. And this is the point made by Spence. He said, quality, what is quality? Quality is something that looks like this. Higher quality, you raise the entire demand function. It's benefit to everybody. It's like a public good. However, a monopolist, a firm, is only maximizing its own profit. What is the best way for a firm to maximize profit? Look at the guy who is just indifferent between buying and not buying. Screw this guy. Choose the quality that is good for him, and then raise the price accordingly to extract all the surplus. Okay? But he has to take into account the fact that he's selling to all the guys above him, with valuations above. So that's a selection. That doesn't change the basic principle. However, Spence was saying that quality is like a public good because all these increments in surpluses, for those who are inframarginal, would also benefit from this, and a firm would not take that into account. So now we have the second divergence between marginal and average appearing in sort of the literature. Quality leads to a divergence between marginal and average, not in cost, but in valuation. The surprise in the literature is that there are demand side and supply side together, okay? And in selection and in quality considerations, each side exhibits a divergence between marginal and average issue. All right, so just taking that into account gets you quite far. Okay. So I've written down the efficient quality, but I don't have time to go through that very quickly. So now let's talk about imperfect competition. Yeah. Duopoly is as simple as it gets. Monopoly, well, we can understand that more quickly, but duopoly, as Henry was talking about like an hour ago, the hoteling model is as simple as it gets. There are other duopoly models, there are other imperfect competition models like no competition, vertical differentiation model. Qualities is sort of more relevant for vertical differentiation. There is a lot more issues concerning marginal and average in cost and selection. Now, the first thing that people have looked at is differentiation in quality. And this has been sort of an underlying theme in industrial organization throughout the 80s, 90s, up until now. Firms use different qualities to differentiate themselves in order to relax patron competition. We are a community hospital, low quality, well, not quite low, but reasonable quality, reasonable price. We are a super good teaching hospital, high quality, high price. We are situated in downtown Boston, and you are in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Do you know where Lawrence is? Almost New Hampshire. A bit far away, right? But that's cheaper, okay? In any case, we have all kinds of results. More recently, we have been seeing some papers trying to model competition in selection market using symmetric models. And I sort of argue that that's not quite right because fundamentally selection is asymmetric. Selection is about one firm trying to use a low quality to attract good risk, and another quality to attract not so good risk, maybe, okay? But they are symmetric? Not, never symmetric. And in fact, there is another set of literature, I pointed out Bardi and Rocher in 2010, they have high quality firm, low quality firm coexisting in oligopoly, duopoly model. I'm just going to recap something like a price reaction in a standard duopoly game. In stage 1, each firm chooses a quality, and in stage 2, each firm chooses a price. And what is the issue? The issue is that quality choice in stage 1 will affect a rival firm's reaction in stage 2. This is the third thing that I wanted to talk about, right? The divergence between margin and average, selection, divergence between margin and average, in valuation, quality, and in imperfect competition, there is quality differentiation, and the quality is used to induce a price change of my rival. Typically, I want to use a quality to make my rival charge a high price, because I want to charge a high price. When my rival raises his price, I can charge a high price. And that's typically the result. One firm chooses a lower quality, going down, and then the other firm chooses a higher quality, going up. Put everything together, we have a little mess. Two kinds of discrepancy in margin and average. Put everything together, and then we have this price reaction effect. So this is more or less today, after a few decades of getting interested in selection and quality in the profession. In imperfect competition now, there seems like there's some interest in trying to understand a few things put together. By now, I don't have too much else to tell you, except that we don't quite know. We have fairly complicated formulas, but let me tell you what has been done as sort of remedies. Okay, so it's a mess, and therefore there are many distortions. Many things become inefficient. Well, you seldom get the first best. You seldom get the efficient allocation. Okay, so what has been done? Well, let me just quote a few papers. Ma and Burgess. This is Jim Burgess, by the way, exactly the same guy that we were thanking last night. Okay, so this is a paper that I wrote with Jim at that time. This is a first paper that sort of argued that we can eliminate this inefficient price reaction quality effect. Why? How do we do that? We just regulate the price. We don't like this price reaction effect messing up our allocation, messing up our inefficient quality choices. Well, we simply regulate the market. Let the regulator choose the price, and those inefficient effects will disappear. And then Randy has some other stuff about creaming, skimping, and dumping. And then Gary Biglaser and I have a paper that says, well, if you separate the market, separate two qualities, so that different firms offer different qualities, reverse selection wouldn't spill over. Okay, market organization can be a remedy in all these complicated things. And then, of course, there are many handbook chapters and Journal of Economic Perspectives, risk adjustment, and most of them are about monopoly or perfect competition, but not much about oligopoly. A second theme that we have seen is that we can use public policy to do something like a remedial service. Eliminate one private firm, make it public. Let the public firm be a disciplinary sort of agent. The good thing about a public firm is that you can give it instruction. You can choose objective function other than profit maximization. And in a recent paper that I wrote with Lisa Langley, this just came out in GBO, we argue that this sometimes can work. Without selection, then using a public firm to substitute for one private firm can restore quality efficiency. Okay? That's more or less what we have, and what I have time and the research that I've been able to talk about. There are inefficient outcomes when there is selection, when there are quality issues and imperfect competition. Average not equal to marginal is one main takeaway. Price reaction, another main takeaway. Unregulated oligopoly, not quite good. Try to regulate, try to use industry policy. The role I had is to see how far we can push, how far we can all put these things together and see what kind of other result we can obtain. Thank you very much.
I think we have a bit of time left for questions. So again, if you can come up to the microphone if you have a question for Albert. So maybe I'll kick off. Yeah, I think just following on from this, your last slide here, which obviously we're running out of time. The difficult question is always to come up with, policy implications or how to draw together all these messages from the theoretical literature over time about to what degree should provider competition be regulated or not. And here we're not talking about the insurance market, so we're not talking about adverse selection, moral hazard in insurance and stuff. We're talking about the providers competing on quality for patients and sometimes on price as well. So yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, but how would you sort of summarize what your views are about to what extent government should be, I guess there's on the two variables, to what extent government should be sort of regulating prices paid to healthcare providers, and secondly, to what extent this sort of competition on quality is a good idea or not, and being the cost versus the benefits of these types of policies.
These are very difficult issues. like David Cutler was saying the other day, nobody knows how to reduce healthcare utilization. We do have many results. We do have, sometimes stylized models in which there is some hope of achieving better outcomes. Okay? Typically, the principle is more is better. More firms typically tend to be better. Karl Popper's discussion about competition is the merger analysis was quite striking. When firms merge, when competition becomes less intense, things go badly. Okay? So it's something like that. We have just a duopoly model in here. I've just talked about that. But in general, you can imagine that we can expand our discussion so that we have more firms in the picture. Right? So we can do something like that. The difficulty is it will be very hard to obtain analytical result. I'll be happy to do simulation, to do more calibration type of analysis, but those are things that we should look at. And second, these instruments available to the government, like quality standards and pay for performance, and like what Henry was telling us, they are insightful, they're useful. We have been experimenting with all kinds of policies. Every few years, we have a new set of terms for, now it's capitation, population health payment, and so on and so forth. Right? So those are things that we should continue to explore. Right? So I'm not saying that we have all the solutions available, but this is our job to continue.
I think we have a question here at the front.
Hi, my name is Amrita. I'm from the Gates Foundation in India office. So what we see in many rural parts of India, at almost all rural parts of India, and 60% of India's population is in...
I couldn't quite hear the echo.
Can you hear me now? So I'm from the India country, and what we see in India, that 60% of the population lives in rural India. Now, the challenge is, in rural India, the main provider is really the public provider, it's the government. They provide primary care, and they provide the first access to emergency care and secondary care as well. Now, that is very low in quality, and nobody really wants to go there. So they spend a lot of money in going to nearby urban areas and larger cities, and pay a lot of money out of their own pocket and fall into poverty. What I'm seeing here is the corollary to what you're proposing. By adding a private sector which is of reasonable quality in rural areas, would that raise the bar for overall quality and access for rural population, and then therefore sort of people would start going to nearby places and reduce out-of-pocket expenditure? I'm trying to sort of draw from these insights of market competition.
This is yet another very difficult issue. The models that I've been talking about are so abstract, so they're not quite calibrated, they've not been set up to understand specific economies such as India. That's one thing. That hasn't stopped many other people from doing experiments in development economics, and especially in developing countries that they have set up various real experiments to do that. And I think Gaia was pointing out, we can look at preferences, but we can also look at market. We can see how changing market setup would affect primary care and other subsidiary services. So, and I think we can base, the underlying principle, the difference between marginal and average, the price reaction effects, they don't go away. Whether it's developing or developed country, they are still there. Right? Those are guiding principles that we can look at. Selection will always be there if it is not an apple.
Thank you.
Carol?
This is a bit of an ill-formed question, I think, Al, but I was thinking about, if you think about adverse selection as hidden information, one of the things government does in these kind of markets is try and increase information. So I was just wondering about what you thought about the role of increased information in solving anything.
Information should be regarded as an incentive instrument. Manipulation of information, I think, should be explored. In fact, Henry and I have a little paper that shows if you are able to manipulate information, you can do very well with cost reimbursement.
Okay. Yeah.
Because this, whatever information that you produce, consumers have to think about where this information is coming from. If it is produced by the provider, they must have done something about their quality, about the value of the services that they produce. So, I mean, we see that now in Massachusetts. Blue Cross Blue Shield has sort of tier pricing. They classify hospitals into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1 is typically more expensive. They are sort of the major teaching hospitals. Tier 2 are not so expensive. And then tier 2 are the sort of the value hospitals. Okay, so as a consumer, I have to think about how do you set up this tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 thing? I mean, I would be a little bit cautious, right? I have to understand, I want Blue Cross Blue Shield to tell me how they set up these things. And then I make my decisions accordingly. If I have a common cold, I don't see a doctor if I have a common cold. If I have an allergy, I may need to see a doctor. Do I want to go to tier 1? Maybe tier 3 will be enough. It's just a rash. Okay, but if I have something more serious, then tier 1 becomes relevant. And then you have to step back and see how a hospital decides whether it wants to become tier 1 or tier 2. I think that's a very valuable incentive instrument that we can think of. Coupled with pay for performance, coupled with prospective payment, capitation payment, population-based payment, I think these are very valuable instruments.
Okay, great. I'd like to follow up on this question. I thought this was interesting because there are quite a lot of these models you've been working on, I think, with Henry, and I've done some work as well on this question of hospital report cards. To what extent does reporting quality information about hospitals affect various outcomes like quality or some of the selection and things? So what you touched on there is that this reporting quality can be used as an incentive mechanism, and in some situations, I understand, improving information improves the outcome in the market, so less selection, and in other situations you might have improving information deteriorates the outcome. But is it so when you're setting public policy, though? I mean, often people regard, publishing more information as always being a good thing, that we want to inform consumers. So what do you think about this in a public policy setting? In this hospital markets, it's a good idea to have more information because it improves outcomes. But in this other hospital markets, it gives too strong incentives to engage in risk selection or something. That seems like a unworkable policy, right? That you could actually decide on public reporting works in this scenario or not. It's kind of all or nothing. You kind of have to have public reporting of everything or not. What do you think about that? I think that's interesting.
There's one way to classify, right? There's one easy way, is not so easy, and it's obvious way is to classify whether the information is going to change consumer decision more or firm's decision more. I still remember this magazine. Nobody is using that very often. It's called Consumer Reports. It's a very popular U.S. magazine that rates many things. Colleges and many things is being rated. One of the things that it rated was wine. Wine, good, right? And then it rated a fairly unknown Australian Chardonnay. And said, this is a good wine. For $8 a bottle, this is super good. And consumers were very happy they've discovered a gem. And then what happens next? The following week, the price has gone up to 12. Well, this is more information, but does more information allow a firm to capture more surplus, more profit? And I think that's a relevant issue, right? So I become tier 1, okay? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends on whether the price has been adjusted accordingly. If the regulator allows the firm to continue to raise price, well, I think consumers will be hurt. Otherwise, you've got to take a sort of a broad picture and see whether the information is going to fundamentally change consumers' behavior or firms' profit-maximizing behavior. Right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very
and
much.
I think we should just say thanks again to all the speakers.